Good evening. Please stand. Every fox a den, every bird a nest, but the Son of Man has no place to rest. Every heart a man, every king a throne, but the Word made flesh, no earthly home. Your burdens light and your yoke is easy. Your name is love and your grace is free. My heart was locked, but you had the key. Make your home in me. Make your home in me. Lord, you come to me in your hopelessness, burning in your eyes, such a great distress. Who will heal your wounds? Who will make your bed? I will comfort you. I will share my bread. Your burdens light and your yoke is easy. Your name is love and your grace is free. My heart was locked, but you had the key. Make your home in me. Make your home in me. Where there is love, there is no fear. So make your home and residence here. I'm so alive when you are here. So make your home in me. Your burdens light and your yoke is easy. Your name is love and your grace is free. My heart was locked, but you had the key. Make your home in me. Make your home in me.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. My name is Emily Suda, and tonight's topic is the consistent ethic of life. It is a topic that deals with some sensitive issues. So one of my disclaimers is this is going to touch a little bit on politics. The consistent ethic of life is about Catholic moral principles and values and priorities, but politics are one of the key ways that those things get put into practice in our communities. That's my first disclaimer. My second is I used to have a high school teacher who about every other day would hold up some book that he really loved and say, this should be required reading. And as a teacher, I kind of adopted that myself. So this is the book that my talk is based on this evening. It's called Resisting Throwaway Culture: How a Consistent Life Ethic Can Unite a Fractured People. It came out last year, and it's really a good book for our times as we face a lot of extreme partisanship and division in our nation, and even down to the level of among family and friends. So this consistent life ethic is something that has been around for a bit in our church. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what it is and kind of how it's developed, and then the challenge that it offers us in terms of trying to get beyond this great fracture that exists in our culture, and even like I said, within families and within our church, when it comes to how we put our moral priorities into action. So the consistent ethic of life, it's deeply rooted in the scriptures and in Catholic moral tradition as it's developed over the centuries. But the first person to really name and develop it explicitly was Joseph Bernardine, who was the Cardinal of Chicago in the early 1980s. And in that time, the United States and the world had been dealing with massive threats and acts of violence. In the first half of the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, and in the second half, there was a protracted war in Vietnam. There were bloody revolutions in Central America, assassinations of people like John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. We had the aftermath of the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision. And underlying all of this was the Cold War and the arms race that was going on between the US and the Soviet Union that kept the world under the shadow and threat of nuclear annihilation. And in response to this last threat, in 1981, the US bishops established a commission on war and peace, and Cardinal Bernardine was appointed to lead it. 2 years later, the bishops voted overwhelmingly to approve a pastoral letter, a letter from all of the bishops to all of the people, Catholics in particular, in the United States. And that document was called The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. And it took a prophetic and very strong stance against nuclear proliferation. In that same year, Cardinal Bernardine was named the chair of the Bishops' Pro-Life Committee and was invited to Fordham University to give the Gannon Lecture in 1983. It's a big annual lecture there. And in that speech, the cardinal, who came after having worked on this document on the nuclear race and also was the head of the Pro-Life Committee, in that speech, he put forward a new framework for understanding Catholic moral teaching and the vision that it offers for human flourishing. And he saw this as a great opportunity and a gift that ought to be shared with civil society. So the consistent ethic of life centers on the inherent dignity of the human person, each of whom is uniquely sacred because we are created by God in God's image, and therefore our lives ought to be protected. In his original lecture, Bernardine focused specifically on the connection between the threats to life posed by nuclear weapons, abortion, and capital punishment, explicitly linking them together in a way that hadn't quite been done up to that point. Those were issues that sort of traditionally, the left worried about nuclear armament and was focused on nonviolence and peace, and the right focused on abortion. And both sides really accepted capital punishment. Over time, there were intense reactions to this framework that he created, both positive and negative, and so it pushed him forward to continue thinking through and communicating more clearly about what this consistent ethic meant and how it could be applied and incorporate further issues. So he eventually spoke and wrote about how things like poverty, euthanasia, healthcare, all were part of this big framework of a consistent ethic of life, because all of those things touch on instances where there is a threat or a harm to human life. One of his big challenges with this consistent ethic was that we have to remember that human life is not only sacred, but it's also social. And the flourishing of any one human life cannot be understood except in relationship to others and in relationship to community. So we have a moral responsibility as people of faith, not only to protect human life from direct threats at all stages of development, Sometimes this is called the womb to tomb perspective. But we also are called to give ongoing aid and support in order for human life to flourish as God intended. Cardinal Bernardin was particularly concerned that Christians who claim the pro-life mantle make sure to follow through on their commitment to lift up human life and dignity in all the stages between birth and death. He said in his initial address, "If one contends, as we do, that the right of every child to be born should be protected by law, then our responsibilities do not stop at the moment of birth. Those who defend the right to life of the weakest among us must be equally visible in support of the quality of life of the powerless among us, the old and the young, the hungry and the homeless, the undocumented immigrant and the unemployed worker. Consistency means we cannot have it both ways. We cannot urge a compassionate society and vigorous public policy to protect the rights of the unborn, and then argue that compassion and public programs on behalf of the needy undermine the moral fiber of society or are beyond the proper scope of governmental responsibility." And although Cardinal Bernardin stated that we shouldn't gloss over or ignore the real differences between the issues he attempted to connect, so for example, in Catholic moral tradition, there's a whole framework around war and how do we evaluate the morality of war that doesn't exist for something like euthanasia. He said that, he tried to articulate the common characteristics among these issues and called the faithful to coherent reasoning. Those committed to an authentically Catholic set of moral values have to resist the temptation to silo or isolate individual issues apart from all others, or to hold contradictory beliefs about issues that affect human life. Bernardin's vision has been carried forward by Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis. And this vision continues to challenge the false dichotomy that we're presented with in the public sphere today between left, right, liberal, conservative. Our church doesn't live in that kind of space. And it challenges the political tribalism that we find ourselves in today. So I'm going to kind of trace through the popes, kind of what they emphasized. Pope John Paul II, during his papacy, picked up the refrain of the consistent ethic of life, especially in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. This document focused primarily on beginning and end-of-life issues. He spoke at length about abortion and euthanasia and the church's position on those issues. But his moral vision extended well beyond those issues. In that document, he invoked the Didache, which is the most ancient, non-biblical writing of the Christian church. It contrasted the way of life with the way of death. The way of death, for the early Christians, this is like 1st, 2nd century Christians, the way of death included those who procure abortion, as well as those who showed no compassion to the poor, who do not suffer with the suffering, and who advocate for the rich and unjust judges of the poor. Drawing from this early Christian tradition, John Paul II warned the church of both the ancient scourges of poverty, hunger, endemic diseases, violence, and war, and new threats that are emerging on an alarmingly vast scale. He echoed the Second Vatican Council in forcefully condemning all practices that are opposed to life. Any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, as well as disgraceful working conditions, where people are treated as mere instruments of gain. All these things and others like them are infamies indeed. That's from the Second Vatican Council document. Pope Benedict XVI continued in the same vein, writing in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate that it is false to distinguish between pro-life issues and social justice issues. Abortion is not only a life issue, it's a social justice issue. Any single abortion doesn't take place in a social vacuum, and our approach to it ought to involve identifying and rooting out its systemic causes, as well as the barriers that make the choice for life seem impossible. Similarly, global consumerism, environmental concerns, and care for the poor are not only social justice issues, they are life issues, because at their heart, they are about the lives, and too often, the suffering and death of human persons. In carrying on this teaching, Pope Francis has used some new lenses and metaphors to communicate the consistent life ethic. He uses the phrase throwaway culture to name the opposite of what the consistent ethic seeks to affirm. In throwaway culture, everything, including people, is reduced into things whose worth consists only in being bought, sold, or used. When throwaway culture finds people inconvenient, inefficient, or burdensome, they are ignored, rejected, or disposed of. The most serious and obvious example of reducing a person's inherent value to that of a thing is their being violently killed. Practices like war, genocide, terrorism, and the death penalty. Throwaway culture also includes practices like abortion, which discards a child as inconvenient, and euthanasia, which treats the elderly like baggage to be discarded. Pope Francis also echoes Cardinal Bernardin and Pope John Paul II in saying that the dignity of the human person has an inherent social dimension. Respecting life is not only about resisting direct violence, but also violence within social structures. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," applies to what Pope Francis calls our economy of exclusion. He uses particularly harsh language in condemning economic systems that ignore or discard human beings if they are deemed a net drag on growth. The homeless person who dies of exposure. The child without adequate health care who dies of an easily treatable disease. Island-dwelling people threatened by climate change. In such an economy, the love of money, something Francis calls the dung of the devil, overrides the dignity of the human person. Those thrown away in the pursuit of profit and wealth do not matter, and ultimately, Pope Francis says, such an economy kills. Francis' alternative to a throwaway culture is what he calls a culture of encounter. Every supporter of a consistent ethic of life is called to give particular care to those without power on the margins, those who find it difficult or impossible to speak up on their own behalf. We owe special concern for the least among us, Francis says, no matter how troublesome or inconvenient they may be. This concern goes beyond donating money or enacting laws. While these are good and often essential things to do, Pope Francis summons us to go beyond them, to get our hands dirty, to move ourselves out of our safe spaces to the peripheries where we can encounter the excluded and marginalized. Such encounters are necessary not only for Christians who are called to find Jesus in these relationships and be evangelized by them, but for anyone who wants to avoid the trap of deciding in advance what people need before getting to know and love them. The wealthy and privileged often determine the problems and solutions without having a single conversation with those who need the help, which often leads to solutions that fail to honor human dignity and may even cause greater problems. To bring back the example of abortion, this means, a counter of culture means actually listening to the stories of women facing unplanned pregnancies, rather than reacting to the abortion issue based on generalizations or false assumptions we may hold about these women and what drives them to seek abortions. Rather than assuming that it comes from a place of feeling anti-family or anti-religious, consider the fact that nearly 60% of women who have abortions already have at least one child, and about half profess the Christian faith. They are mothers, and many are sitting in our churches. I mentioned earlier that abortion is a social justice issue. 3/4 of women who have abortions in the United States live at or near the poverty line. Our church's social justice tradition calls us to examine to what extent barriers such as a lack of affordable housing, healthcare, childcare, paid family leave, and other critical supports might be preventing women and families from seeing the choice to birth and parent a child as an imaginable choice. And that's just one of the many life issues, too. They're all multifaceted, they're all complex, and they're interrelated. Usually, if you go to work on one issue, you will find yourself having some effect on another as well. So I will leave you again with a recommendation to check out this book, Resisting Throwaway Culture, Charles Camosy. What he does in this book is he goes through a whole host of issues and looks at them in light of the church's consistent ethic. And so he goes through sexual ethics, he goes through reproductive technology, abortion, poverty, immigration, environmental justice, euthanasia, war, and the death penalty. So you can check him out for more. This could be an hours-long talk if I tried to address all of those. Otherwise, I'll end with some final thoughts about the challenges facing us, but also a note of hope. The great challenge before us as Catholics with this consistent ethic of life in our tradition, the challenge is to seek unity, which doesn't mean uniformity. In Cardinal Bernardine's words, the consistent ethic does not say everyone in the church must do all things. No one is called to do everything, but each of us can do something. For many life issues, there are legitimate debates over the specific policies to best address them. And Catholic social teaching does not exist to give us specific policy. It's to give us values, principles for action. But as Catholic Christians, Bernardine said, we should be vigorous in stating our case, but also attentive to hearing others' case. We should test everyone's logic, but not their motives. We can strive not to stand against each other when the protection and the promotion of life are at stake. A huge component of this challenge of unity is that we must resist the temptation to be ruled by right versus left arguments. When Pope Francis visited the US in 2015, he urged us to confront every form of polarization which would divide us into these two camps. And Catholics who take the fullness of the Church's moral teaching seriously, given our current options, will find themselves politically homeless. But we're not alone in this. Despite how much the media magnifies political disunity in our country and sometimes stokes that disunity, the reality is that about 2/3 of us in the US belong to what one study called an exhausted majority. And this is a quote from the study, we share a sense of fatigue with our polarized national conversation, a willingness to be flexible in our political viewpoints, and a lack of a voice in the national conversation. The consistent ethic of life offers Catholics in particular an opportunity in this moment in history to be prophetic witnesses and to offer a more uniting vision for our society, not based on a political ideology, but rooted in shared values. There appears to already be a major shift away from political binaries already underway. And wouldn't it be amazing if Catholics could lead the way in joining hearts, minds, and hands to forge a new path forward?
soul, you know. You are hope that will not let me go. You are the voice I follow. You lead me home. In the stillness of my soul, you know. Lord, you know. In the past, we've opened up if anyone had any questions for a speaker, and we would be more than happy to answer any questions you have or any queries. If you have a question, please put up your hand and we can get you a mic, and if you'd like to ask anything, please feel free. As you all know, our church is going through a little bit of a transition. Father Arju will be leaving us here towards the end of the month, and we will be having Father Stephen Kenyon come. And so it's our hope that we will get a chance to speak with him about continuing the Lighthouse. For right now, we're still planning on holding it. The next one will be on Tuesday, July 13th. Same time, same place, maybe a few different faces. But as always, thank you for being here and sharing your time with us and our community. That's all. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.